Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group and network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Of course, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow, rate, and review us on your podcast app, and check out our new Substack. Well, it's not new. We're just posting on there, which is kind of new. So check that out. We have links in the show notes to make all this stuff easy to find. It really does help so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Dr. Alexander Vindman. Alexander Vindman is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and was the Director for European Affairs on the White House's National Security Council. Colonel Vindman served in the Pentagon as a political military affairs officer for Russia and attaché at the American embassies in Moscow and Kyiv. He holds a doctorate in international affairs from Johns Hopkins, where he's a senior fellow. Alex also leads the Institute for Informed American Leadership at the Vet Voice Foundation and the Here Right Matters Foundation, which focuses on helping Ukraine win the war against Russia. He's the author of Here Right Matters, which we discussed last time he came on the program, and his new book, The Folly of Realism, How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine, which has already been referenced a number of times, as a lot of folks might know on this show, and we'll be discussing more today. So last time we talked, it's nice to see you, first of all. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back on with you. It's kind of been a busy stretch for me between the election and a book coming out and an unintended home renovation project. Kind of all over the place, but yeah, good to be on with you.
I always seem to be talking to you when life is happening. I think last time Eleanor was getting ready for bat mitzvah. Did that all work out pretty well?
That went great. Let's see, actually, this is a picture of the bat
Oh, that's
mitzvah.
awesome.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
great. So
Yeah.
Rachel and Eleanor are causing good trouble. I follow Rachel, so I see she's causing good trouble.
Ellie is causing trouble too, often good.
Is she becoming a young activist? Is that what's happening?
Well, so she is active in her speech and debate team, which frankly for her is a really good comfort zone. Um, she is very much an extrovert and thrives on kind of on interacting with people. And I think that the speech and debate program has allowed her to kind of organize her thoughts, start to conduct research, and probably has gotten her to be a lot more focused, which is good.
Oh,
She's
that's great.
she's uh, she's doing great, and she's going into high school next year. So yeah, I know it's pretty fast.
Wow, wow. Well, very much in the spirit of the family. Eugene is Congressman Eugene now. So, I was curious how you're obviously you and your twin brother are obviously very close. How's it been for you, Eugene, being part of the minority party and his first, his freshman term?
Yep. Well, I actually saw him yesterday. He was down from Virginia for a fundraiser. Um, and I see him. I try to see him as much as possible. I'll be in DC next week.
Mm.
He is settling in. I mean, it is interesting. I kind of put it in a bit of a military context, how long it takes you to kind of get comfortable in your job. And some point along the way, by the time you get into the 8 to 10 year mark, you might be switching jobs, but you're comfortable and kind of understand what you're supposed to be doing. There's a learning curve to each new kind of command, each new staff position, but you could jump in and immediately start pitching in. I think there's a learning curve to being a congressman, and there are different roles for different congressmen. I think there are the kind of the vocal media activist type folks like um, uh, AOC, Bernie Sanders, my friend Eric Swalwell, and they still legislate, but they're kind of they communicate for the party. And then there are folks that are much more comfortable on the policy side. And Eugene comes from a legal background. He's about getting things done. He wants to pass laws and find ways to get things done, even in a chaotic, second Trump term. And he's also focused on delivering for his constituents. Excuse me. People sometimes forget that, congressmen, even if they have a national profile, and Eugene has got a national profile, they're hired by their constituents. He represents about 770,000 people in Northern Virginia, and his primary task, if he wants to stay in office and continue to do good things and deliver for the nation also, is to make sure that he does constituent services. He addresses the issues for when people have need help, and he's built a really, really solid team to do that, as well as score some legislative wins, even finding bipartisan support, and even operating from the minority. So he's doing well, with a lot of frustration still with this administration and having to fight and push back and try to put some guardrails with a minority that doesn't really have much recourse. People forget that the minority, they could stomp their feet, shout, jump up and down, and they should sometimes. This is a time to brawl. At the same time, they need to figure out some solutions and find the remaining willing parties on the other side of the aisle in the majority to get things done.
It's interesting. I saw my own congressman here a couple times over the last few weeks at fundraisers. There's charity events, not just congressional fundraisers, but charity events. And Congressman Whitesides here in California, 27, spoke very much about the same thing, that even though he's in the minority, he was speaking very proudly about opportunities he's found to work across the aisle. What do you, not to put you on the spot, but what are some examples of opportunities that
Sure.
your brother's been able to do that?
Yeah, so I met Whitesides first. I thought he was, really kind of sharp and capable individual. And interestingly enough, there's a congressional rank associated with like each one of these congressmen. And within, so it goes from the folks that have been in the Congress the longest, high sequence numbers, and then in the freshman class, you really get down to like 435 or something like that. And the only person behind Eugene, I think, might be Whitesides. So he's like the second because his alphabetical order. He's senior to Whitesides in this
Right.
kind of like a really strange order of precedence. So that's it was kind of funny. The biggest thing I think one of the biggest things that Eugene accomplished, and he takes pride. He received kind of a score from Northern Virginia Democrats with excellent marks, with a little bit of criticism on the fact that he he was carrying the water for his district and their views around certain issues. So a couple times he's had to compromise to deliver for the district and represent the district. But he's ranked like the second, the 200th and something most progressive, which in one side, of the spectrum, you could say like, well, there are a whole bunch of activists on the side of getting things done, but Eugene represents a district that is extremely purple, very swingy. He won, by about 2% of the vote, 8,000 votes in a pretty close race. A district that's suburban, exurban, relatively small city, and then a 30% of the population is agricultural, rural
Okay.
agricultural. So you could just think about that wide range of different views in that spectrum. So kind of center left, center right, that really required to elect. So he kind of takes a little bit of pride in that. He actually, in one regard, he's pretty disappointed because he considered himself he should be pretty progressive. But on the other side of the spectrum, like, that means he's pretty moderate and represents his district pretty well. But a concrete example of something that he's delivered. In the early days of the Trump administration, I think it may have been even a day one executive order demanding federal employees report back to in-person work. Trump does these things not surgically, but with a sledgehammer or chainsaw, if you prefer. And he didn't recognize that what that would mean for the military and military spouses. It was going to really hammer military families. Why? Because military personnel move very often. At one point, I moved 11 times in 10 years.
Mm,
And in order to be able to sustain employment in the federal government, spouses have to have kind of remote work setups so they could continue to work even though they're constantly moving from different locations.
right.
And he found bipartisan support and signaled that there was going to be kind of a revolt to this approach, and got the administration to issue a subsequent executive order to exclude at least military families and military spouses from the situation, preserving thousands, potentially tens of thousands of jobs that really are necessary because people don't realize, how at the junior ranks, how marginal getting by is. I mean, we're talking about SNAP benefits that go to certainly junior enlisted or even kind of middle enlisted that have families, or even second lieutenants. See, this is the officer ranks that, depending on where they live, they require kind of SNAP benefits and support in order to meet kind of minimum threshold and stuff like that. So helping those families out, was he's kind of gotten a bit of a cult following amongst military spouses, and that was just, to me, a good early example. But he's done a number of different things. Um, there was something he did recently. It'll come back to me, that he's pretty proud of, but it'll come back to me.
Yeah.
He's a bunch of different things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And what you're saying about serving your district, I would imagine that there are a lot of federal workers in Virginia's 7th, but
Huge.
also specifically the purple nature of that district. It seems that, the popular on the national level means you're making your base angry and afraid. But there's others who are, who are really interested in legislating and serving their district. California 27 is very much the same. We are so closely divided. Mike Garcia, who held this district for 2.5 terms prior to George Whiteside's taking it, won his first full term by 333 votes out of over almost 350,000 that were cast.
Yeah.
That's a purple district. So that one piece of legislation that you describe is a really creative way of addressing, of understanding the constituents of your district, but specifically crafting it in such a way that you could find support from folks who have an R before their name as opposed to a D
Yeah.
before their name. That's really great.
I, I'm proud of Whitesides because he was able to oust a Republican, convert red to blue, but also oust a Republican, Mike Garcia, who had served in the military and was in what I refer to as the insurrection caucus. Somebody that on January 6th voted to invalidate the election results, um,
Of
and
Pennsylvania and
was a target.
Arizona. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right. That
and
was
I.
my biggest objection to Mike. I had high hopes for him, for
Mhm,
Congressman Garcia. And there
mhm,
were a couple moments when he took an independent stance prior to the January 6th, January 7th, when he took those votes to overturn Pennsylvania, Arizona. He was one of the minority of his party that didn't sign on to that amicus brief that came out of Texas, the Texas AG, that was looking to, at similar efforts. So I thought
yeah.
that there might be hope. Someday I'd love to have a long conversation with him, maybe get a couple tequilas in him and
Mhm.
see what it really was. Because I've had conversations with him in the past, and he doesn't strike me as one of those Fox News personalities who's doing things,
Yeah.
the show horse versus the workhorse. He very much strikes me as a principled workhorse kind of a guy. But some of his votes just really confounded me,
Yeah.
especially when it came to the fabric of our democracy. Um, One of the things I was asking you about your family, but I'm fascinated not just by the activism of your family and the principles that course through your family's that you said very much from your own dad and your own nuclear family, but your family's history. In the acknowledgments to the new book, the folly of realism, you mention that family history. Has anyone Has anyone in your family done any research to try and learn more about how far back the family's roots go in that region? You were born in Ukraine, and I think
Yeah.
you had mentioned your part of the family got there in the mid 19th century. But is there any other history that's been done about the roots?
It's there's it is a very, very tough effort to track genealogies for a couple of different reasons. I think the fact is that the Soviets in particular did a very good job of kind of wiping out family histories, or attempting to wipe out family histories preceding um, the revolution. And I think that different pockets of the population might be able to go deeper in Ukraine. So, like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church would keep potentially, good records and rolls. And depending on how much damage the Soviets did, some of that is recoverable. I don't think that a lot of the Jewish genealogy and records survived. So we kind of have some small bead on where the family may have come from, at least on the mother's side, my mother's side, to Hungary in the whatever 1860s or 1880s. Um, on the father's side, it's less clear. I think it's the port of Odessa, sometime in the late 19th century, and potentially kind of trading guilds or something like that. But it's very, very speculative, and unfortunately, uh, both my grandfathers, my mother's and my father's fathers died in the war, fighting the Nazis. So
Mm,
that is a portion of the family history that is harder to track. My my grandmother, my dad's mother passed away before we were born. So really, not it's his living memory. It's something that we may have gotten from his sister who passed about 10 years ago, and what she may have passed on to her children, my cousins and stuff like that. But really, it's hard to track down. It would be nice. I keep thinking that uh, um, I think it's Henry Louis Gates that does it. Will
yeah.
do something and can track down. But I don't know how accurate it would be.
Yeah, we were only able to surmise. To your point, we can go back at least to the mid 1800s, but we were only able to surmise based on larger movements of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe. It makes me. I was grateful for the maps. You have these the maps at the beginning of the book where you could see the lines of what's now Ukraine. So we know that my family comes from what's now Cherny Ostrov, Ukraine. My grandmother always called it Russia, and it was such a over the last, especially 5 years, to not only shift from referring to the Ukraine to Ukraine, but like
Mhm.
understanding it and diving into the history more specifically. That's actually one of the things I was curious about. First of all, having gone there, having been born there, were you ever back before you were serving in the military? And what was that like going back as an adult?
Yeah, so I want to that part of the world. My first trip was in 1997. It's because my older brother was an investment banker working in Moscow. So my twin brother and I took a trip, and so this was in kind of in the later part of the wild 90s, actually before the big stock market crashes and stuff like that. Still heavy kind of imprints of the Soviet Union on Moscow, and we traveled a little bit. My first trip back to Ukraine was actually not until 2008, and well into military service.
Oh wow.
We're talking about almost 10 years into military service. After I transitioned from being an infantryman to a foreign area officer, kind of a soldier or diplomat, and I was working on studying Ukrainian language. I was educated in Ukrainian by the Defense Language Institute, and I had an immersion course. I want to say in 2000, I guess it was in no, it was in 2009 is when I
Okay.
took my first trip to Ukraine, and then I was assigned there not too much later. So I was there in like the spring of 2009 for 2, 3 weeks, and then went and lived in Ukraine for about a year, 2009 to 2010. And that would have been my first experience, first time visiting the gravestone of my mother that passed away,
Oh,
or
wow.
tracking down a great uncle, which was fortunate. I managed to catch him. He was 88 and elderly and in failing health. And my twin brother visited me, and we both had a chance to meet him and have lunch with him. And he passed about a month later, but we had a chance to kind of reconnect and hear a little bit about our grandfather and kind of that family story. And my most of my experience with Ukraine early on, it was as academic and paying attention to the geopolitics, and then hands on in 2009, and then repeat throughout that post 2009 period continuously. So multiple trips there, a score of trips there over the course of the subsequent 15 years.
Were you now you described the events, especially dive pretty deep into the events after in the post Cold War era, right? Over these last six presidential administrations now. Were you aware enough of what was happening? Certainly not to the degree that you are now, having done a dissertation on it. Um, but was that what piqued your interest to look to work there in your military career?
So I think early on, when I started to pay attention was probably around the Orange Revolution, frankly. In 2004, I was deployed to Iraq, but watching the Orange Revolution unfold and kind of taking an interest in it, recognizing, some really kind of top line features like Ukraine trying to chart its own course pro-West and Russia attempting to wrestle Ukraine back into its orbit under its thumb and its sphere of influence. I think back then, I was still probably in a Russia centric world
Right.
where I think my generation, really folks that came in the late 70s, like I did in the early 80s, maybe in the early or late to late 80s, early 90s, we were coming out of this Soviet mindset and milieu, and from that standpoint, we kind of accepted Russian exceptionalism, great Russian power, the Russian narrative about the Ukrainians as like oppressing the Jewish population and being Nazis and things of that nature, and not really being educated on the deeper context for the region and the struggles between Russian domination and the imperial period going back hundreds of years to the Soviet period to the present day, meaning or the contemporary period, the last 35 years, how it's been a struggle of really kind of narratives, Russian believing it's the regional hegemon, it's the inheritor of like great Russian power. They that's why I went into this 1,000 years back into the book in the first chapter,
Yeah.
talking about Kiev and Rus, this important regional heavyweight and how Russia ties itself. It was called Kiev and Rus to be clear. So Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and they focus on the Rus part, which is kind of the predecessor to Russia, which is an interesting place to kind of try to they have their narrative. The Ukrainians have their narrative about of fighting for independence, and I really didn't parse that out when I first started paying attention in the mid 2000s. But I think as time wore on, especially as I became as I recognized my strong suit would be leveraging my cultural and language abilities, speaking Russian, and moved over to this different career field. Then I started studying the region, and it became clear that those superficial narratives were in fact superficial and simplistic and intended to kind of advance Russia's cause and didn't account for the complexity of the fact that Russia was equally oppressive and to the Ukrainian Jewish population, and I think my firsthand experience there for a year added enormous context on Ukraine that um, I had the chance to visit, for instance, Chernobyl, and understand the importance of Chernobyl to the Ukrainian drive against nuclear weapons and independence from the Soviet Union. I had a chance to understand the kind of composition of Russia, its pro or its Russian speaking, formerly pro-Russian populations versus the Ukrainian Western leaning portions of the country, and really have a kind of a tactile sense for these important things that I think without having that firsthand experience and really diving deep into the region, you miss. So I do damn, I guess, to a certain extent, multiple administrations for repeating the same mistakes over and over. But it's because we really didn't invest or have the expertise on this country in this region. We had that more, like I described myself as, Russia leaning or Russia kind of exceptionalism, uh, embracing um, experience in my early years. That's the bulk of the U.S. national security establishment, really, for everything up until the last really 10 plus years. It was all, from Russia's lens,
Right.
Russia's view of the region, and not enough folks understanding, the complexities to be able to provide good counsel and good policy advice to
Yeah.
our leaders.
I do want to dive a little bit more into the historical context and Russian exceptionalism, this mindset. But before we get to that, I'm really curious about something more on the personal side. As I've mentioned, some of my family came here right after World War I. In fact, March 3rd, 1921 was the date that that part of the family, my grandmother and her family, landed on Ellis Island. But some stayed behind in Cherny Ostrov in Ukraine. And they came to the States right after you did in the early 80s, actually, early to mid 80s. So I have to figure out when those dates were and what was happening politically that allowed them to get here, because there was, to your point, there was things closed down in the late 70s. So I have to figure some of that out. But this is what I wanted to ask you. One of my cousins um, uh, has taken exception to my, I guess, for lack of a better word, my pro-democracy stance. She's very much an election denialist, very much pro-Trump, and I wonder, and she's taken other Putin-friendly positions. I wonder, number one, if you have extended family or friends from Ukraine who have that mindset, and are there because you do kind of the book is helpful because it splits the um, the profiles between Moscow Putin leaning versus EU Western US leaning. So I'm wondering if but that's what I'm trying to make sense of it. She's here, so I'm wondering if that's the mindset. There's a certain mindset that is more prone to buy into, I
Yeah.
guess, the fictions of a Putin and Putin friendly stances.
Yeah. So I think it's part of this is kind of, not education as in like education levels or institutions, but how well read you are on the region and what's going on.
Yeah.
If you are not necessarily kind of, interested in reading on the region and understanding its evolution, its history, then you might be subjected to the same kinds of views that I had or my dad still has about like Russian power and who the bad guys were and the good guys were and stuff like that. Although he's, definitely softened quite a bit. Um, he still has like, I think he's more ambiguous about like where Crimea belongs than I think, if he was more read up on the he hasn't read my book yet, so maybe I'll, make sure he reads it and then
Yeah.
then he can tell me what he thinks. But I would say that I run across this really, really quite often. I'd say the generation that came over in the late 70s, early 80s, even early 90s, emerging out of the Soviet Union is much, much more prone to reject anything left-leaning,
Mm.
buy into Russian narratives. And this is not just a Russian, Ukrainian, Eastern European perspective. There's a lot of this actually in the Vietnamese community or the Cuban community. Very, very almost as like a double victim of both the oppression or um, you know the genetic memory of trauma as well as like lived experience. Uh, fleeing as refugees from those populations, and then being subject to the kind of propaganda narratives that are still kind of central, um, that have them reject not just left leaning, but kind of even democratic institutions and values. So I run across this relatively often with Russian speaking populations that are both deeply pro Trump, but also buy into the Russian narrative. And I
Mm.
think the easiest way for me to understand it is that they're just being victimized by that trauma.
Right, right. That's interesting because you live in South Florida now. So bringing up the Cuban population, having lived through the Castro regime, that they're allergic perhaps to anything that looks remotely, far left. So that makes sense. Like I said, the one thing I'd love for you to color in some more for us. It was such an epiphany, so eye-opening to read about some of that thousand-year history of Ukraine having its own independence. We're so prone to think of Ukraine
And
as just part of the USSR, right? So I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit more for us.
so I mean, these are both Russia and Ukraine are kind of relatively modern constructs. Um, if you go back 1,000 years ago, before the first millennia, you had Kiev and Rus, which was seated in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, and it was the regional hegemon. It dominated, swaths of the region. It had significant influence, even as far as Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. Um, Russia didn't exist.
Yeah.
The predecessor to Russia, Muscovy, didn't exist. Moscow and the Kremlin weren't established until about 1150-ish.
Mm.
So hundreds of years later. And part of the reason that Russia or the predecessor of Russia flourished and Kievan Rus ultimately disappeared is that Kievan Rus, even as it started to, as empires do, started to kind of unravel power struggles amongst multiple princes and things of that nature. Um, it still had the desire to withstand the attacks of other empires, and they ran against the Mongols. So the Mongols sacked and burned and razed Kiev in the early part of the 13th century, like 1221. Um, and Russia went a different way. Russia decided to become a vassal of the Golden Horde for to various degrees, really, for a couple of hundred years.
Yeah.
It wasn't really until hundreds of years later that it started to kind of against the Khanates, as they were called, started to kind of exercise some independence and assert its sovereignty. And this is in this period of time, no real power centers in Ukraine. Ukraine kind of dominated by different regional actors. Russia starts to gather strength, and really in about the 1500s, really starts to expand in all cardinal directions, north, east, south, west. Before there was some loose interaction between Kiev, or that the population of the Cossacks and what's now Ukraine and the Russians in Muscovy, loose interactions, but not until Russia starts expanding. And this is an expansion that really goes now is approaching, like, 500 plus years of Russian expanding in all cardinal directions, did they start to kind of butt up against each other. And the 17th century is really where the close interaction between these countries, or the predecessors to these countries. I want to be clear that, like, these are not the same countries we have now.
Right.
Muscovy didn't turn into a Russian Empire, until really the 17th century, and Ukraine, in around the same period, had kind of a little bit more of a consolidation of its national identity. There was a bunch of, like, Cossack hetmans, like kings, horsemen kings that kind of governed the region. Um, but in this period of time, Ukraine, to be as clear as possible, was in a very, very tough neighborhood, surrounded by Russia on one side, Poland on the other side, so Catholics and Ottomans on the south, and was looking for a way to kind of assert its own independence, and decided that it would go with its kind of kinsmen, its fellow Slavs, fellow Eastern Orthodox. And I thought that it would kind of do, a temporary engagement with Russia to be able to carve out its independence. Russia took this as a permanent condition, and really from this middle of the 17th century on, attempted to assert its domination over Ukraine, never fully, really slowly kind of consolidating authority over this region that was still trying to assert its independence um, through the 18th century, through the 19th century, and really in the 20th century is when Russia finally, the Soviet Union at this point, acquired the remaining parts of what is proper Ukraine today. It was the most western parts that were under the Habsburg Empire, that were at times were governed by the Poles. This was like Lviv, the westernmost portions. And they also adopted or seized a part of Ukraine that had the most consolidated Ukrainian identity. So, what I guess the story is a struggle for Ukraine to constantly assert its sovereignty and independence in its various forms, even before we had a proper Ukraine. Russia, as an imperial power, attempting to grow in each cardinal direction and assert its dominance under new territories, subdue Ukraine. Ukraine, in particular, because of this whole tie into this ancient Kievan Rus, reunifying, Rus under one state type of thing, part of this great like imperial narrative, and Ukraine struggling for its independence all the way through achieving it briefly in the after the end of the First World War, but for just a period of a couple of years, and then the Soviet Union seized Ukraine, and then ultimately in 1991, where Ukraine secured its independence to this present day, but now struggling against Russian military aggression.
And remind me of the quote that really distilled Russia's self-perception that without Ukraine, it's a nation or a country, but with
Yeah,
Ukraine, it's an
it's
empire. Do I remember that right?
yeah, that's accurate. It's a Zbigniew Brzezinski quote that to paraphrase says that Russia, absent Ukraine, ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and subordinated, it becomes an empire. That's how important Ukraine is. So it's a national identity component. It's a raw power component. It needs Ukraine's economic power. It needs Ukraine's human power. The population of 43 million before this war started into its full scale in 2022. Um, Russia wanted that population to add to its own Slavic population to make sure the demographics are like what the Russians want. Russian whites dominating other minority populations, because the trend lines were not in that direction. And the military industrial base, the political power, all of that required for Russia to be a viable um, empire in the 21st century.
Right, right. Now, one of the other huge epiphanies for me in reading the book is something you mentioned about your own mindset. And my mindset is to see, I grew up watching the Rocky movies. And, if we think of ourselves as Rocky, the US as Rocky, and Russia as Ivan Drago, equal adversaries.
Mhm.
But after the dissolution of the USSR in a post-Cold War era, you point out that's we're giving Russia too much credit, aren't we?
Very much so. I think, there were elements of Russia that are undeniable. It was and is the largest country in the world.
By
It
geographic
has,
territory.
by geographic
Yeah.
territory, it has a near peer nuclear arsenal. So basically the same size as our nuclear arsenal right now in terms of active warheads, about 1,550 nuclear warheads, all sorts of, it has a nuclear
No,
triad and stuff like that.
that's a really good point. But if the U.S., I guess during H.W. Bush's administration, didn't help to, out of fear of what might happen, I think we trace you traced in the book how H.W. Bush's administration was getting the nuclear arms out
Yeah.
of fear that there would be kind of loose nukes in the territory of Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's partly our
So
fault.
it is to a certain extent. I think, so the bigger story is we succumbed to we both bought into Russian exceptionalism
Yeah,
because of these artifacts I mentioned, largest country by
right.
territory, massive nuclear arsenal. That, the Russian narrative is that they were kind of entitled to dominate that region. It was part of the Russian Empire and stuff like that. And it was their own kind of privileged backyard. We didn't quite grant that full kind of idea to them, but it was maybe tacitly accepted
Yeah,
that Russia had a greater authority in its region. But the other part of this is that we succumbed to misplaced hopes and fears, hopes that if we were accommodating enough, granting Russia this special, unique status, that it could preserve this relationship and bring Russia into the community of nations. And also fearful that if we were doing too much, if we were condemning Russia or too conditional with Russia, if we did like we did in defeating our other great foes in whether in World War II, Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, and compelling a transformation that ultimately created allies for us, right?
right,
Germany and Japan are great
right.
allies. We didn't take that approach with Russia. We were very, very much accommodating with Russia. Partially because we also didn't win a military victory. Clear, I mean, it was a different kind of struggle. They were defeated and fractured, but um, we were fearful of what that might mean with the fact that they still had a nuclear arsenal. I think nuclear arsenals, put you in a different league to a certain
Mm,
extent. So
yeah,
what we ended up doing is really catering to Russia in a way that sent the signal that they could do whatever they want in their own backyard. Um,
and you also
and
point out that we sent the signal to other nations that the way to basically play the U.S. is to be a nuclear power.
it's a very, very dangerous message to send because we are very, very focused on deterring nuclear proliferation. That was part of the story that you alluded to George H.W. Bush putting so much stock into his relationship with, first Gorbachev, but then ultimately Yeltsin,
Right.
and deciding that the best thing to do is to consolidate the nuclear arsenals of the new emerging states, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine inherited massive nuclear stockpiles. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world, 4,500 nuclear weapons. And we decided that the best thing that we could do is consolidate all those nuclear weapons for Russia to be able to dispose of, which they did in certain regards, but in other ways they didn't. Like, for instance, these strategic bombers that they took possession of from Ukraine, those are bombers that they are using now against Ukraine.
Mm,
So, Soviet era bombers. Um, some of the tactical nuclear weapons that Ukraine had in its possession could very well be part of those arsenals that were turned over in that period of time that are now menacing not just Ukraine but NATO and use in a conventional fight against the U.S. and NATO. So there was a moment in which we looked at different courses of action. We looked at whether it merits um, heeding Ukraine's demands to maybe maintain a small nuclear arsenal. Um, Dick Cheney, as the Secretary of Defense, kind of made that case, but he lost out to this other view about nuclear proliferation, which is interesting because while we still are on the same kind of policy direction, we have also along the way sent the message that a nuclear stockpile is the ultimate security guarantee. It puts you in a unique situation in which you're uh, no longer subject to uh, use of conventional U.S. military,
hmm
um, and may very well be encouraging countries like Iran to get very, very close and maybe eventually break out and with its own nuclear arsenal.
Yeah. I should have anticipated that we'd really get into the weeds because I really enjoy your ability to geek out in a, a winsome and approachable way is fantastic. I knew I'd go down some rabbit holes here with you. So I want to get to something really overarching that I took away from your book, and that is the concept of neo-idealism. So you trace through these six administrations going back to Bush one. Bush one and the Clinton administration, the focus was on denuclearization. Bush two obviously shifted focus, but the global war on terror, the greatest threats, again, that
Mhm.
was the consistent theme. Obama had this I um, the original idealism, not the original, but the idealism of the reset. We could do a great reset with Putin, right? Or
Mhm.
his famous talk, off mic, the captured mic moment with Medvedev, and then you really put a simplify it with Trump, but you hit the nail on the head. Trade U.S. interests for personal benefit. Um, and Biden seems to have gotten a little bit closer, but seemed to be always, as you would put it, a day late and a dollar short. Um, and what was surprising was when you talked about the administration being afraid, I guess you could say, of Ukraine winning too much. So, given all of these different flavors of mistakes in how we were in our diplomacy and how we're dealing with these two countries, what is neo-idealism and why
Yeah.
is that the right path forward?
So I tried to take this. Neo-idealism is a little bit wonky, so I'll break it down in a different way. I basically point out that due to hopes and fears, we consistently acted on what was immediately in front of us. Very, very short-sighted. We were looking at different small ways we could win with Russia. Some of them were meaningful. I'm not discounting the fact that when we achieved a new start and reduced the nuclear stockpiles significantly, that was a meaningful one. But there were a lot of other things that didn't materialize. Russia was not a partner to us in rooting out international terrorism. They ultimately, funded, put bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, offering money to the Taliban, things of that nature, as well as selling weapons. Or climate change, this idea that we were, that was going to be an area that we could somehow work together. Um, and fears that if we were conditional or condemnatory, that could take us down the wrong path. So, in this effort to look for kind of less than meaningful wins or hold our ground when it mattered, we sent the signal to Russia that we could be easily manipulated. We sent the signal that Russia could act with impunity and graduate from mischief making, kind of coercion, economic pressure to hybrid warfare, interfering in Ukraine's elections as a good example, or cyber attacks on Estonia, whatever the case might be, to outright military aggression, Georgia, and then Ukraine. And what neo-idealism fundamentally does is it recognizes the failures of this short-term approach, catering to hopes and fears, and takes a much, much more practical and pragmatic approach to figuring out a way to tether us to what really matters long term. So the way I figured that we could do that is by focusing on values, the centrality of values to our interests. What could be an example of a value? Our strong, extremely important relationships with NATO and our
Mm,
fellow democracies that deliver security for us,
right.
that are allies with regards to NATO, or that are like-minded and apply their political energies to the things that matter to us because we share interests, values, and threat perceptions, or that they're our most important economic partners. And if we take this kind of approach, then we don't look at what's bright and shiny and immediately in front of us, or buy down these short-term risks that are really not kind of that are misplaced, right? So I want to make sure it's clear that I'm not dismissing the fact that there's a risk of potential nuclear war with Russia. I'm just saying that it's tiny and insignificant, mainly because of mutually assured destruction. The Russians don't want to be wiped off the map any more than we do, and based on that fundamental understanding, we could take a much more kind of interest preserving line. We could be a little bit more hard nosed in the way we conduct ourselves with regards to supporting Ukraine, for instance. So the idea here is that if we put values front and center, it allows us to correct for the mistakes of the past, gives us a long-term view on what we really need to accomplish. And I think, I also, because I'm deeply worried about where this country is headed, I think there's a very practical approach to correcting for the Trump administration. We have moved, part of the folly of realism is that we have Trump,
Mm.
who doesn't understand, doesn't care about the lessons of the past, doesn't care about who our alliances are, who our enemies are that want to wipe us off the face of the earth. Everything is potentially a deal immediately in front of him, like a blank slate. No understanding that he's not going to get what he wants out of Russia and that he's harming the relationships that really make us strong. And this is extremely short term and transactional. So we need a way to correct it. And on the back of end of the Trump administration, a neo-idealist approach allows us to focus in on what really matters: fellow democracies, hardening fellow democracies, bolstering struggling democracies, those democracies that are experiencing a backsliding, like we are at this moment, and then nurturing democratic institutions. And we obviously disarmed ourselves in a big way by getting rid of USAID, but it's an example of the kinds of investments we're going to have to make on the back end. And these are long term kind of, this is a generational. Our investments on the value side of the equation are generational. They're not going to, and if we're stay focused on them, that we could plug away and rebuild American moral leadership. So it shouldn't be, I want to be clear because I tend to think of myself as pragmatic. This is not ideological or idealistic. I think it's a very practical way to correct from the excesses of realism, which says that, a country pursue their interests maximally and everything breaks down to a transaction, and that there is a better way to conduct our foreign policy and domestic policy for that matter.
Yeah, yeah. What's funny is that what you're speaking in a geopolitical context, but I can't help but thinking just even in terms of the way that I'm trying to raise my kids. The way you speak of the way you distill the neo-idealist path is values are part of our interests, and interests are derived from those values. So placing those values first, it provides, I would think of it as the compass. I think you refer to it as the continuity that we need
Yeah,
to inform those policies based on not just long-term goals, but short, medium, and long-term goals. So I really
yeah.
appreciated that. Now,
It's a self-help book.
that's right. The Folly of Realism, the self-help book. I love it. So I want to ask you a couple related questions. One is about what concerns you the most, but one is about what you hope for. But before you get to the hope for part, I want to contextualize that in a special way that I think you'll enjoy. So first the bad news. What concerns you most now that we've elected Trump and we're in Trump 2.0? You had a great post on your Substack. I should say a really helpful post that you described America First fumbles and reshaping the federal government. So that's all helpful. So I'd love for you to share with us what you're concerned about most about this moment that we're in now.
Mm. There are many different layers to this question. I'm concerned about the geopolitics of the moment and the lessons that our adversaries are taking. I think, and our friends, frankly, we're a enemy to our friends and a friend to our enemies, the traditional ones.
Yeah,
Our friends to our friends, we're no longer reliable and predictable. And some might see that as a way to kind of squeeze some additional gains,
I
but
couldn't
it's
help but think.
it's
Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help but
destabilizing.
thinking of you when I saw watching that terrible Oval Office
Zelensky,
meeting.
yeah,
Yeah, with Zelensky. So yeah, to your point. I mean,
disgusting.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah.
it was pretty disgusting. I mean, like universally, I've not found to anybody that's like, maybe in the social media sphere, but nobody thought that was a good look for us. Um, so I think that, it's destabilizing. It is a recipe for chaos. It's also an opportunity for our enemies to watch this discord, these divisions, um, fracture alliances and looks and gives them opportunities to exploit for economic benefits or for maybe even military territorial acquisitions. So we're we're facing a world in which there are going to be more conflicts. On the domestic front, because the US is still kind of the indispensable nation, even though Trump is taking us backwards. Um, and the US still has that raw power, still the largest economy, most powerful military. That's going to take more time for Trump to really damage that component because the underlying kind of strength is there. I'm really worried about um, Trump as an unconsolidated authoritarian looking to send the signal that the system is his. There is no rule of law. It's whatever he says it is. And civil society has shown itself to be very, very kind of weak-kneed, at least initially. I think it's part of the shock and awe campaign of the Trump administration, and a lot of folks individually, like tech bros or institutions, law firms and academic institutions, bending to his will, and now maybe a little bit more kind of a resolve and a resistance. But I'm concerned about the fact that this country will lose its way. I don't think it will. I think Trump is his own worst enemy and will create enormous amount of damage. I mean, getting rid of different things like Consumer Protection Bureau that affects folks, each and every one of us, kind of our personal economics, or USAID that is seemingly an overseas function, soft power, our ability to provide aid across the world, but also like sentinels, listening posts for crises or managing disasters before they become like full blown crises that affect us. Those types of things are gone and will have to be replaced, rebuilt. Um, but really more concerned about what this means with regards to his ability to affect kind of um, steal elections or tip the scales of elections in his favor through what Stephen Levitsky, a scholar at Harvard, talks about as competitive authoritarianism, where you're an authoritarian, you want the legitimacy of elections, but you tip the scales of those elections in your favor. So the SAVE Act to take away the rights of women to vote, married women to vote, crazy stuff. These identification requirements that will disproportionately affect kind of um, poor and working class folks, um, making it harder for people to vote by mail, all these types of things to try to steal an election. I guess what I ultimately settle in, and maybe this could be what you were referring to that I wrote on my Substack, is I actually think that the Trump administration is making lots of mistakes. He's trying to bandage and package them up as victories. Like he creates a tariff war, a
Right.
tax on the American public, and then says he solved it.
Right.
And he'll point to the fact that the stock market, which is frankly, if you have confidence in these like the swings of the stock market, I don't know. It is not comforting that like all it said all some happy words are enough to move the stock market or
Right.
down or up for that matter. That's
Yes.
not stable. But I think that there will be so many people hurt over the course of the next year and a half that there is an enormous opportunity to put in some guardrails and check presidential power. When you start talking about tariffs and economic recessions, inflation going up, the prices of goods going up, you're talking about the vote that what people actually vote on.
Right.
Those are the bread and butter kind of issues, um, and that is not something that he's going to easily be able to skew and say, well, it's going to be the undocumented or it's the folks streaming across the border that are causing this, or the Democrats that are not in power that are causing this. I think it's the tax on Social Security as a working administrator of a social safety net that's the most popular in the country, providing resources to the retirees
Yeah.
or disabled folks, or Medicaid, that is tens of millions of people use that in cutting Medicaid or making it harder to access Medicaid. This is not going to leave a lot of room for fence sitters. I talk about this dual scourge of apathy and complacency. Apathy for those folks that were left behind that didn't feel the touch of democracy, what was in it for them, couldn't really get worse, are going to see it get worse. And those folks that were complacent, buying, this snake oil of I could get you another 5 or 10% on your stock portfolios, seeing how that plays out for them. Um, that's going to leave a lot of people potentially energized to reject Trumpism and really check presidential power, at least in the second half of the last 2 years. It's part of a typical pattern, a historical pattern, where the party in power gets, treated pretty harshly anyway.
Yeah.
Trump is just going to amplify that. And I think I see not, this is a tide that Trump is not going to be able to hold back. I mean, the tide of people power. So I guess I don't want to be overly kind of optimistic. My optimism, if it's there, comes out of a place of deep pessimism of how bad things are going to get, and to wake people up. But I think that's what concerns me, the domestic component more than anything else.
Yeah. No, it's a good reminder because at the end of the day, there was so much there's so much talk in the folks who are reading the news every day and really plugged in about why Trump got elected. But at the end of the day, there were about 7 million people who showed up for President Biden that didn't show up for Kamala, and then about 3 to 4 million people who showed up for Trump in 2024 that didn't show up for him in 2020. And those are the people who decided the election, the ones who didn't show up, and then ones who who voted, the extra people who voted for Trump this time around.
You
And
know,
those
I'm
folks,
more. I would just say I'm more optimistic. I mean, there were 90 million people that were eligible voters that didn't show up,
yeah,
and that's the part that we need to try to figure out how to, because the margins shouldn't be this close.
they shouldn't be this
Um,
close. Yeah,
yeah,
it shouldn't be
and
this
that's the
close.
apathetic side.
And at the end of the day, I think what motivates those folks who are ultimately going to either show up that don't always, to your point, or some people who truly are swing voters, it's what they can feel. They're not paying attention to the news. They're paying attention to what they're paying for gas and eggs and very day to day kitchen table things, if you will. Now, I do want to ask you what you're hopeful for, but in this context, I think a lot of folks were surprised by the election of Pope Francis. Do you think, are you hopeful that that's a leading indicator, or I don't know, maybe that's not your purview? So
Well, I mean, the Pope is a geopolitical player.
yeah,
So it is not just a small city, state of Vatican City. It's the fact that he has massive influence over 1 billion Catholics,
right,
which is a significant portion of the population. So I would say that we wouldn't necessarily have Prime Minister Carney in Canada, or it's clear we wouldn't have Carney in Canada without Trump.
right,
We wouldn't have the Liberals retain power in
in the UK, yeah.
In Australia
Oh, okay,
without Trump. And I don't know if we would have Pope Leo without Trump. I
mm,
think it's a rebuked Trumpism having an American Pope that is not. I wouldn't say that he's particularly like uniformly critical, because there is something to be said about it. He has a kind of a moderate conservative streak, as far as I can tell, kind of more of a layman perspective. But he does stand on principle, deep principle, kind of, what the Bible tells you about or teaches you about kind of how to conduct yourself as a Catholic. Um, and having that kind of criticism come from an American Pope is probably more, even if it's, measured and to not be kind of a diatribe, but be appropriate to the moment. I think would be is important. He's a Chicagoan. He's the son of a veteran, a Navy man, which is a really kind of a cool thing too.
yeah,
I'm not sure if that's that obviously the first American Pope, so the first one to be the son of any service member.
Right.
Um, and this is a good thing. I would really admired Pope Francis. Kind of a beautiful soul that, regardless of religion, you could appreciate. Where his heart was to do good for humanity. I think that Pope Leo will serve in that same lane. Um, so I'm proud that we have an American Pope,
Yeah, that's great.
and and screw those clowns that are critical of him, like woke Pope or some nonsense.
Yeah. Well, so I want to start to wrap this up. You're in such an interesting position to answer what I call the TP&R question. You and Rachel have faced more than your fair share of not just harsh commentary, but literally death threats. Um, but it sounds like you're in a community, and I would imagine being on the campaign trail with your brother, you faced some folks that would consider themselves political adversaries, yet still neighbors, I would hope to think. So the TP&R question is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So
Yep.
people with different backgrounds and beliefs who than we do, people who vote differently, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even
Yeah.
possible?
I think it's totally possible. I think, frankly, I find it pretty easy to talk to people, as long as they don't, and I don't really face this kind of situation where, like, people come up to me and start yelling and shouting at me. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah,
I mean, it comes across that way on social media and things of that nature, but um, I could, I think it's a little bit disarming that I come from a military background, served for decades, and people respect that. I think the military profession is still, uh, you know, the most, or one of the most cherished in the U.S. Um, I find that I could have, you know, I have. I'll give you an example. I've got folks, working in my home now because we had a leak and I had to do some repairs. And the gentleman is from a Cuban family, and we have had multiple conversations about uh, our different, just almost diametrically opposed viewpoints about where this country is and where the dangers lie, and who Trump is. And I'd say that, like, there was a lot of wishful thinking about
mm,
Donald Trump.
yeah,
People got much more than they bargained for, and they're now, there was like a conversation today. It was like, well, what are you hearing about, like, this approach to Social Security? Because he's worried about his elderly parents. I'm like, it is in fact, a dangerous development. So I think you could find, because people are driven by what? Family as the number one thing. Family, being able to provide for their family, taking care of their kids, making sure their kids have access to kind of prosperous future, and being able to connect on those levels is a very, very effective way of approaching somebody that may have very, very different views. And most of the time, you know, I'm open to having those conversations. Every now and then, you catch me in a bad mood, I'll just kind of stay away and talk about the things that we have in common rather
right.
than the things that separate us. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room for common ground, for many Americans.
Yeah, for sure. And there always is. There's always something. There's always some kind of connecting point that gives you a kind of terrain that's a little bit safer to have some of the harder conversations where you do diverge. Um,
Sure.
do you have any questions for me?
I do. I wanted to hear your view on, your view on the Pope. Actually, I think, I'd be curious to hear, given the fact that you have the unique background of Judaism and Catholicism.
Yeah. Well, I'm not Catholic. I became a Christian. And what's funny
Okay,
is
so
before I became a Christian, I wasn't hyper aware of the different denominations and how things separated out. But I'm drawn to Catholicism because I find that the praxis of
Mhm.
Catholicism is a lot more like Judaism in that
Yep.
you're sort of the practices of Catholicism, you're participating in the story of your religion, right? And just like like the Seder or all the Hanukkah or any of the high holidays, you're you're participating in the story of your people. So I really appreciate
Mhm.
that. So your religion isn't just something that is some kind of belief, some theoretical belief. It's something that you're participating in across generations. Now,
Yeah.
Francis in particular, so from Francis to Pope Leo. Oh, sorry, I said Francis before. It's Pope Leo now. Um,
Yeah.
so, so from Francis to Pope Leo, I really appreciate number one what they have in common, and there are a couple of things that I see so far. One is that they're thinking about the church as not trying to get the best tweet of the day, but they're thinking over the course of centuries, right? They're thinking about the impact of their ministry in terms of how it's going to affect the church over the course of centuries. And I really appreciate that larger perspective. Now, there are a lot of progressives who'd like to see more progress, whether it's
Mhm.
LGBTQ issues or, women in leadership or things like that. But man, these things take time when you think about it in terms of centuries. So I appreciate that, but I also appreciate that there's at least movement there. There's at least conversation there on some of these really really difficult issues. I also appreciate that it looks like Pope Leo's ministry is going to be a field hospital as opposed to something up on the high hill, the way that Francis would talk about it, meaning that
Mhm.
he's going to be among people who are in need, among people that he can minister to. I really appreciate
Awesome.
that. And it gives us a different way to think of people who are on the butt end of, in our case, a lot of Trump's policies. I every time, and it's friends of mine, I don't want to sound like I'm wagging my finger in their face when I say, dude, can you stop saying illegals? They're human beings. I
Okay.
hesitate to say that because I feel like it's going to discontinue our conversation. But Pope Leo clearly has lived a life of serving human beings. Whether they happen to
Yeah.
be on the wrong side of these lines in the sand that we cross that we call our borders. So that's just one example. But I do have a lot of reasons to be hopeful that he's going to continue the work of Pope Francis, which is, I think, a good thing. So.
Yeah. Very much agree.
Yeah. So before we go, how can folks follow you online, keep up with what you've been up to lately, and learn more about all the great work that you're doing?
Thanks. So yes, I'm still on Twitter. I think it's important to not see that ground, and I tend to have pretty fiery criticism because it's time to brawl against Trump's abuses.
Yeah.
I'm on Blue Sky. My probably most easiest way to find me is on Substack
Yeah.
at avindman.com. I'm there pretty regularly, pretty substantial following at this point. And then this book that's out, I think is if you're interested in history and you're interested in self-help, uh, that's a good way to find me too.
That's great. Yeah, and again, the book is The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Really a terrific read from start to finish. Really appreciate you coming back in, Alex. It was great hanging out with you. Um, we got to do this in person at some point.
That sounds good. You're in LA.
I'm in LA, but I'm going to be in DC next week, so I might hit you up offline and see if I can buy you lunch or a beer or something.
I'm there for I'm passing through on Monday and Tuesday, heading up to New York. I've got a conference on Russia, Eastern Europe, and
Oh, then we'll miss
in
each other. I
Colombia.
get there on
Yeah,
Tuesday, but we'll have to make it happen at some point.
definitely.
It'd be really terrific.
Looking
Thanks
forward to
again.
it. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. Thanks, Corey.
you bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review, and now you can watch these conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/at politics and religion. And I am at Corey S. Nathan at CoreysNathan on all the socials, as well as Substack. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.